The wind across the plains of what settlers had started calling Texas was constant and dry, carrying the scent of dust, sun-baked grass, and the fading trace of buffalo. In the summer of 1872, that smell lingered like a memory, faint but not yet gone. For Toya, daughter of Chief Tashunka, the wind was a reminder of her place. She'd grown up hearing it outside the lodge walls, always steady, always present, like the drumbeats of ceremony or the quiet rules that shaped her days. Her future had never been a question. It was set before her like a well-worn trail, clearly marked, clearly expected. She stood on a low, grassy rise overlooking the sprawling circle of painted teepees, the smoke from the evening's cooking fires 100 hazy prayers lifting to the heavens. Her hands, so skilled in the delicate, patient work of beading intricate, star-like patterns onto doeskin and tanning buffalo hides until they were as soft as a cloud, were clenched into tight fists at her sides. She was beautiful in the way of the plains people, with eyes the color of dark, wet earth after a summer rain and hair as black and shining as a raven's wing, braided thick with strips of sacred otter fur. But a shadow lived in those eyes, a quiet, deep-seated resignation that dulled their natural fire, like a veil of smoke before a flame. She was a princess, a title that felt more like a gilded cage than an honor, its bars forged from love and responsibility. Her worth, she had been taught since childhood, was measured not by the kindness in her spirit or the sharpness of her mind, but by the strength of the alliance she would bring. She was promised to Vokin. Vokin was a warrior of great renown, a man whose ambition was as vast and consuming as the land itself. The union would strengthen the Kiowa, bind two of the most powerful families, and create a necessary bulwark against the encroaching world of blue-coated soldiers and land-hungry settlers. It was a good match, a wise match. Everyone said so, from the wisest elders in the council to the women who gossiped by the creek as they filled their waterskins. No one ever asked Toya. She felt the truth of their wisdom in her bones, a cold, heavy thing, like a stone she had been forced to swallow in her youth. Vokin was strong, yes. He was a great hunter, his lance always the first to strike the heart of the buffalo. He was a fierce fighter, with the eagle feathers in his war bonnet to prove his many coups. He was handsome, his features sharp and proud, arrogant, but he looked at her not with affection or even desire, but with the unconcealed pride of a man acquiring a prized, perfectly bred horse. He saw her lineage, he saw her father's power. He saw the strong sons she would bear to carry his name and inherit his stature. He did not see her. He did not see the part of her soul that felt a silent kinship with the wild mustangs that ran free in the west, the part that longed for a love as untamed and elemental as the thunderstorms that rolled in from the horizon, shaking the very ground with their passion. That part of her was a secret she kept locked away in the deepest corner of her heart, a silent, solitary grief for a life she would never know, a person she would never be allowed to become. Her days were a seamless tapestry of routine, each thread woven with duty and embroidered with silence. She helped her mother, Istas, a woman of quiet strength and immense dignity, manage the chief's large household, her movements always graceful and efficient. She taught the younger girls the sacred stories of the tribe, her voice a soft murmur against the constant whisper of the wind, telling them of the day the Kiowa came into the world through a hollow log, one by one, until a pregnant woman got stuck and blocked the way forever. She performed every task with a placid expression, a mask of serene acceptance that she had perfected over 18 summers. No one saw the profound loneliness that settled upon her in the quiet moments before sleep, a loneliness so pervasive it felt like a physical weight on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She was surrounded by her people, at the very heart of their life, yet she was utterly isolated, a polished stone in a medicine pouch, valuable but untouched by warmth, unseen in the dark. This was her stasis, a life of quiet desperation, a long, slow exhale of resignation to a fate she felt powerless to change. Just yesterday, the bars of her cage had seemed to shrink around her. Vokin had returned from a successful hunt, and as his betrothed, it was her duty to meet him and praise his skill before the people. He had stood before her, the blood of a great pronghorn buck still drying on his arms, and had presented her with its heart, a great honor. But as he did so, he had taken her arm, his grip possessive, a gesture of ownership for all to see. "Soon, you will be mistress of my lodge," he had said, his voice a low rumble for her ears alone. "It will be the greatest lodge in the camp. You will bring me much honor." It was not the words, but the tone. The assumption of her compliance, the prideful glint in his eyes, that had made her skin crawl. She had smiled, as was expected, the perfect, dutiful daughter. But inside, the wild mustang of her spirit had kicked against the corral, a futile, desperate gesture. One sweltering afternoon, seeking a brief respite from the suffocating weight of her own thoughts, she rode her pinto mare out from the camp, heading west. She followed a shallow creek bed where the shade of the cottonwoods offered a sanctuary from the sun's relentless glare. She was looking for wild sage, its clean, sharp scent, a balm to her restless spirit. The air was heavy and still, the world drowsing under the drone of insects and the shimmering heat. Her mare, usually so placid, suddenly shied, its ears twitching back and forth, its whinny a sharp, nervous sound in the oppressive silence. Toya's hand went instinctively to the small, sharp knife at her belt. Her eyes, trained from childhood to read the subtle language of the land, scanned the dense brush. And then she saw him. He lay half-submerged in the muddy, slow-moving water of the creek, a man sprawled as if he had been thrown from the sky by an angry god. He was not Kiowa. His moccasins were of a different style, the beadwork a pattern she did not recognize, and his breechcloth was decorated with symbols of the sun and the hawk. An arrow, fletched with the feathers of a prairie hawk, was buried deep in his shoulder, the wood shaft snapped off. His broad chest rose and fell in shallow, ragged breaths that seemed to tear at his lungs. His face, streaked with mud and dried blood, was turned towards her, his eyes closed, his strong jaw slack in unconsciousness. Around him the earth was torn and trampled, the signs of a desperate, outnumbered fight clear to her trained eyes. The tracks of at least 5 other horses, not Kiowa, perhaps Pawnee or even white men. He was alone, the sole survivor of something terrible. And from the symbols, from the cut of his hair, she knew. He was Comanche. The name itself was a stone dropped into the placid pool of her existence. The Comanche, the lords of the southern plains, old enemies, older than the stories of the grandfathers. For generations, their people had fought, a bitter rivalry over hunting grounds, horses, and honor. Sometimes there was trade, sometimes fragile truces born of mutual need, but the blood between their peoples ran deep and wide like the Red River in flood. To help him was a betrayal of her ancestors, of every Kiowa warrior who had ever fallen to a Comanche lance. To leave him was to let a man die like an animal, to be picked apart by the buzzards and the coyotes, a violation of the spirit of the land itself, which demanded respect for all life, even that of an enemy. He moaned, a low, guttural sound of pure agony that cut through her indecision. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused, clouded with pain and fever. For a single, eternal heartbeat, his gaze met hers. There was no hatred in it, no warrior's pride, no challenge. There was only suffering, a raw, human vulnerability that transcended the boundaries of tribe and tongue. In that moment, he was not a Comanche. He was a man dying alone in the sun. The carefully constructed walls of her duty, of her long-practiced resignation, began to fracture. A feeling she had long suppressed, an instinct for compassion that had been buried under the suffocating weight of expectation, rose within her, fierce and undeniable. She swung herself down from her mare, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She took a hesitant step towards him, towards the enemy, towards the unknown. The wind picked up, rustling the cottonwood leaves above, and it seemed to be whispering a new word, a word she did not yet understand but felt with a terrifying, thrilling certainty. Change. Getting the wounded man back to the Kiowa camp was a feat of desperate ingenuity and secrecy. Toya knew she could not do it alone. She rode back towards the camp, her mind racing, and found her younger brother, Chayton, practicing with his bow near the horse herd. At 14 summers he was caught in the space between boy and man, and he adored his older sister with a fierce, uncomplicated loyalty. "I need your help," she said, her voice low and urgent. "And your silence." Chayton, seeing the gravity in her face, simply nodded. He listened as she explained, his eyes widening at the mention of a Comanche, but he did not question her. He was her brother before he was a Kiowa warrior. Together, they returned to the creek with a travois harnessed to Chaitin's pony. The Comanche warrior was heavier than he looked, all lean muscle and bone. It was a grim, silent struggle to haul his limp body from the water and secure him onto the sled. He was barely conscious, muttering delirious phrases in his own tongue. They timed their return carefully, waiting for the precise moment when the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of orange and purple. In the shifting light and the bustle of the evening meal, they hoped to reach the relative seclusion of their family's lodge with minimal notice. Their hope was a fool's dream. The moment they were spotted dragging the travois through the outer circle, a wave of alarm and raw hostility rippled through the people. A child pointed, a woman gasped, and suddenly they were the center of 100 hostile eyes. Warriors emerged from their teepees, their meals forgotten, hands moving instinctively to knives and war clubs. The elders gathered, their faces grim masks of disapproval and concern. Vokin was the first to reach her, moving with the predatory grace of a cougar. His handsome face was contorted with a mixture of fury and disbelief. "What is the meaning of this, Toya?" he demanded, his voice a low growl that carried over the murmuring crowd. He gestured at the bleeding man on the travois as if he were a piece of filth. "You bring a snake into our home? A Comanche dog?" Toya stood her ground, placing herself between Vokin and the travois. Her chin was held high, though her insides felt like a churning river of fear. "He was dying. I would not leave him to the buzzards." "He is Comanche." Vokin spat the word like a curse, his eyes blazing. "His people raided our hunting grounds not 2 moons ago. They stole our horses. He deserves no less than what his brothers give ours, a slow death under the sun." A murmur of agreement rose from the crowd. It was then that her father, Chief Tashunka, pushed through the circle of people. His presence commanded immediate silence. He was a tall man, made taller by the eagle feathers in his hair. His face was a landscape of wisdom and authority, carved by sun and sorrow, his long braids threaded with silver. He looked from his daughter's defiant face to the wounded man, then back to Vokin's rage, and his expression was as unreadable as a stone at the bottom of a river. "My daughter," Tashunka said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of undisputed power that could quell a battle, "speaks with a woman's heart, which sometimes forgets the lessons written in blood. But Vokin speaks with a warrior's memory, which must never forget. We cannot know this one's purpose or his crime." He looked down at the warrior, whose name they did not yet know. "He is a threat until we know otherwise. He is our enemy, but he is also a man, helpless on our land. We are Kiowa. We are not savages who butcher the wounded." He turned to 2 of his strongest warriors. "Take him to the prisoner's lodge. Bind him. Istus," he called, turning to his wife who had come to stand beside him, her face a mask of worry. "Tend to his wound. See that he does not die. A dead prisoner tells no tales." To the rest of the tribe he announced, "We will not be known as a people who let even an enemy die without cause. But neither will we be fools who welcome a wolf into the herd. His fate will be decided by the council when he can speak." The warrior was taken away, his body limp, leaving a trail of blood in the dust. Toya watched him go, a knot of fear and something else, something she could not name, tightening in her stomach. The camp was a hive of murmuring voices, and she was the source of its disturbance. She had broken a fundamental rule of their survival, and the air was thick with suspicion. Her father's eyes held a deep disappointment, but it was Vokin's gaze that chilled her. It was a look of cold, calculating possession, a clear warning that she had overstepped a boundary he considered his own. She had not only saved an enemy, she had publicly defied her future husband. For the next several days, a tense and uneasy truce settled over the camp, a quiet that felt more like a held breath than peace. The Comanche warrior, whose name they learned was Kavan, hovered in the liminal space between the world of the living and the world of the spirits. Toya's mother, Istus, a woman whose knowledge of healing herbs was respected throughout the tribe, worked with a grim efficiency. She extracted the splintered arrowhead, cleaned the festering wound, and pronounced that the shaft had missed his heart by a finger's width. "The spirits have not called for him yet," she had declared, though her eyes told Toya she was not certain if this was a blessing or a curse. It was Toya who took on the duty of bringing Kavan water and broth, a role she claimed with a firm resolve that surprised even herself. "I brought this trouble to our camp," she argued to her mother. It is my responsibility to see that he lives to face the council's judgment. It was an excuse, and she knew it, a plausible shield for the inexplicable pull she felt towards the stranger's fate. It was a sense of connection that went deeper than mere pity, a feeling that their spirits had somehow recognized each other in that desperate moment by the creek. The prisoner's lodge was a small, isolated teepee at the very edge of the camp, a place of shame and solitude. Kavan was bound loosely at the wrists, a precaution that was both an insult to a warrior and a necessity for a captive. In his first moments of lucidity, his eyes, dark and intense as a stormy sky, would follow Toya's every move as she entered the lodge. They were the eyes of a wolf caught in a trap, wary and intelligent, betraying no fear, only a burning, caged pride. He spoke little, his Kiowa halting and heavily accented. He would accept the water she offered with a slight, almost imperceptible nod, his pride warring with the weakness of his body. Silence was the language they shared most fluently in those early days. In the quiet of the lodge, away from the prying eyes and whispering tongues of the camp, Toya would sit and mend moccasins while he rested, the air thick with unspoken questions and centuries of ingrained animosity. She did not speak of her life, and he did not speak of his. Yet, in that shared stillness, they began to truly see one another. He watched the gentle, efficient way her hands moved, the grace in her posture. He noticed the sadness that flickered in her eyes when she thought he was asleep, a profound melancholy that seemed out of place on the face of a chief's beloved daughter. She, in turn, saw the iron will that kept him fighting for every breath, the way his hands, though bound, would clench as if holding a spectral weapon whenever a sudden noise disturbed him from the outside. She saw the lines of pain etched around his mouth, a pain he refused to acknowledge with a single sound of complaint. He was an enemy, yes, but he was also a man of formidable spirit. One evening, a raging fever took hold of him, a fire that threatened to consume what little strength he had left. He thrashed in his sleep, his powerful body slick with sweat, crying out in a language she did not understand. The words were filled with anguish, the names of his people, she guessed, his family, his past. Without thinking, all thoughts of him as a Comanche enemy dissolving in the face of his raw suffering, she knelt beside him, placing a cool, damp cloth on his burning forehead. "Hush," she whispered, the word instinctive, the tone one she might use to soothe a frightened child or a nervous colt. "Rest now, the fight is over." His thrashing stilled, his eyes, glazed with fever, flew open, and for a moment he seemed to look straight through her, seeing ghosts in the shadowed corners of the lodge. "They are all gone," he rasped, the words a raw wound torn from his throat, his halting Kiowa forgotten in his delirium. He spoke in his own tongue, but the grief was a universal language. "The soldiers, they fell from the sky like locusts, my son." His voice broke on a sob, a sound of such desolation it seemed to crack the very air. He turned his head away, a shudder racking his powerful frame. It was a moment of utter, unguarded vulnerability, a glimpse into the abyss of his loss. Toya felt a sharp pang of empathy, so strong and immediate, it took her breath away. The wall of prejudice, of learned hatred, that stood between Kiowa and Comanche, seemed to her a foolish, brittle thing in the face of such profound, elemental grief. She saw not an enemy warrior, but a man who had lost everything, a man whose soul was as scarred as his body. She did not leave his side that night. She stayed with him through the long, dark hours, fetching fresh water, changing the cloths, whispering soft, meaningless words of comfort, a solitary guard against the shadows that haunted him. She felt a fierce, protective instinct rise in her, a desire to shield him from his own memories. When the first pale light of dawn crept into the lodge, the fever had broken. He was weak, drenched in sweat, but his eyes were clear. He watched her as she prepared to leave, a new, questioning light in his gaze. "You stayed," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. It was not a question, but a statement of disbelief. "The fever was strong," she replied, busying herself with the water bucket, avoiding his intense stare. "My mother said it would be the turning point." "My people would not have done the same for a Kiowa," he stated, his voice flat with the simple truth of it. "I am not your people," she said softly, and finally found the courage to meet his gaze. "And you are not in the camp of your people, you are in mine." In that long, silent look, something profound and irrevocable shifted between them. A silent understanding passed, a fragile thread spun in the darkness from shared grief and unexpected compassion. It was not trust, not yet. It was something more elemental. It was recognition. The soul of one had seen the soul of the other, stripped bare of tribal markings and warrior's paint. And for Toya, it was the first time in her entire life that she felt she had been truly, completely seen. As the sun of late summer beat down on the plains, turning the grass to a pale, brittle gold, Kavan's body began to heal. The angry wound in his shoulder closed, leaving a puckered, star-shaped scar that spoke of his brush with the spirit world. His strength returned, a slow, steady tide flowing back into his limbs, filling out his lean frame. Seeing that he was no longer at death's door, Chief Tashunka, after a long council with the elders, allowed his bonds to be removed. Kavan was a prisoner still, confined to the camp circle and forbidden to touch a weapon, but he could walk freely. He was assigned tasks, menial work meant to humble him and test his character. Fetching water from the creek, tending the vast herd of horses, work usually reserved for boys or captives of lesser standing. He performed them all without a word of complaint, his face a mask of stoic indifference, but his eyes, sharp and intelligent, missed nothing. Toya, in turn, found herself orchestrating the rhythm of her days to the silent beat of his. A trip to the creek for water that took longer than it should, a walk to the edge of the camp to check the snares her brother had set, a visit to the horse herd to check on her pinto. These were small, stolen moments, often passed in complete silence, but they became the new, secret center of her world. The camp buzzed with gossip, like flies on a hot day. The women watched her with knowing, disapproving eyes. Vokin's glares followed her like a persistent shadow, a constant, simmering threat. But Toya found, to her own surprise, that she cared less and less. She was breathing a different air now, an air of terrifying, exhilarating possibility. One afternoon, she watched from a distance as Kavan attempted to repair a broken spear shaft, a tool he needed for his work with the horses. He was clumsy with the unfamiliar Kiowa tools, his frustration a subtle tension in his shoulders. After a long moment of internal debate, she put down the hide she was scraping and walked over to him. "The sinew is too dry," she said, her voice quiet, matter of fact. "It will snap when the wood swells in the damp." He looked up at her, his expression guarded, a flicker of his old pride in his eyes. He did not speak, merely nodding at the tool in his hand as if to challenge her to do better. She sat on the ground beside him and took the spear from his hands. Her fingers brushed his, and a jolt, like heat lightning on a summer night, passed between them. She ignored it, her face serene, focusing entirely on the task. She took a small piece of sinew from a pouch at her belt and worked it with a bit of tallow until it was supple and strong. "Like this," she said, her movements precise and sure, a dance her hands had known forever. She showed him how to wrap it, how the tension must be perfect, tight but not too tight. He watched her hands, his focus absolute, his earlier frustration replaced by a quiet respect. "In my village," he said, his voice low, breaking the long silence between them, "we use the gut of the pronghorn for this. It holds stronger in the damp." "Our way is older," she replied, a hint of a playful challenge in her own voice. For the very first time, she saw the corner of his mouth lift in a ghost of a smile. It was a small thing, but it transformed his face, chasing the shadows from his eyes and revealing a warmth she had not known was there. Her heart gave a painful, pleasant lurch. It was the true beginning of their conversation. Through the language of shared tasks, they began to share their worlds. He showed her how a Comanche warrior could read the tracks of a shod horse from a day's ride away, telling its speed, its weariness, and the weight of its rider by the depth and spacing of its prints. She, in turn, told him the great Kiowa story of the Devil's Tower, how the 7 sisters were lifted to the stars to escape a great bear, their tears forming the Pleiades. They discovered a shared reverence for the land, a common grief for the vanishing buffalo, a mutual fear of the blue-coated soldiers who respected no treaties, no boundaries, no sacred ways. Their talks grew longer, their shared silences more comfortable. One evening, sitting by a low fire away from the main circle, under the pretense of watching the horses, she found the courage to ask the question that had haunted her since his night of fever. "Your family, the ones you lost, what happened?" His face hardened, the brief warmth vanishing like a bird taking flight. He stared into the flames for a long time, the firelight dancing in his dark eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was a raw, quiet thing. "We were on a winter hunt, a small band, my father, my 2 brothers, my wife, my son." He choked on the word, the pain as fresh as if it had happened yesterday. He was only 4 summers old. He had just learned to shoot a small bow. The soldiers came at dawn. They were looking for warriors who had raided a settlement. We were not those warriors, but to them, all Comanche looked the same. They did not ask, they just fired into the lodges. He closed his eyes, his jaw tight. "I was scouting ahead for the herd. I heard the shots. By the time I returned, the snow was red. They were gone. All gone. I have been alone since that snow." His grief was a raw, physical presence between them in the cool night air. Toya felt her own sorrow, her own gilded cage of loneliness, mirrored and magnified in his. Her life of silent duty seemed a small, petty thing compared to his utter desolation. Yet the feeling was the same, the feeling of being adrift in a world that did not see you. "I am sorry," she whispered, the words hopelessly inadequate, a pebble tossed into an ocean of pain. He opened his eyes and looked at her, truly looked at her, his gaze cutting through her defenses. "And you," he said, his voice soft but insistent. "You are the daughter of the great chief Tashunka. You are beautiful. You are promised to a great warrior. You have everything. So why do your eyes hold the same sadness as a woman who has lost it all?" The question struck her with the force of a physical blow. No one had ever asked her that. No one had ever looked past the mask of the dutiful daughter. Tears she had not known she was holding pricked her eyes, hot and sharp, and the story of her own quiet desperation spilled out of her. She spoke of Vokin's ambition, of the political alliance, of the crushing weight of being a symbol instead of a person, a game piece moved on a board for the good of the tribe. She spoke of her yearning for a choice, for a life that was her own, a love that was freely given and received. He listened, his gaze never leaving her face, his presence a solid, comforting anchor in the storm of her confession. When she was finished, her voice a trembling whisper, the silence that fell was not empty, but filled with a new, profound, and unbreakable understanding. He had seen the truth of her soul, and had not turned away. In that moment, sharing the embers of their separate griefs under a canopy of a million uncaring stars, a new, warmer fire was kindled between them. The slow, cautious steps of empathy had carried them across the chasm of suspicion, and they were beginning to find a new footing on the other side, a footing that felt dangerously, wonderfully like love. The protective instincts that had been stirring in her heart for him now felt returned in full. She saw a flicker of the same emotion in his eyes, a desire to shield her from the very unhappiness he had just unveiled. The land around them was harsh and unforgiving, but here, in this small circle of firelight, was a pocket of impossible, life-altering warmth. The shifting dynamics between Toya and the Comanche warrior did not go unnoticed. Kavan, once an object of universal scorn and suspicion, was now viewed with a confusing mixture of grudging respect and deepening resentment. His quiet dignity and skill were undeniable. He had a natural way with the horses, calming the most skittish with a low murmur and a steady hand, a skill highly prized by the Kiowa. He helped the older women with heavy tasks, his strength offered freely and without arrogance. Some of the people, especially those with less standing and therefore less to lose, began to see him not as a Comanche, but simply as a man of character. This subtle change was a galling poison to Vokin. His betrothal to Toya was not just a matter of the heart. For him, it was a rung on the ladder of his ambition. To become the son-in-law of the great chief Tashunka would cement his power, making him a chief in all but name upon the old man's passing. He saw Kavan not merely as a rival for a woman's affection, but as a direct and insulting threat to his meticulously planned future. His jealousy, sharp and bitter, began to curdle into open hostility, and he began a careful campaign to turn the tribe's opinion fully against the outsider. He started with whispers, potent venom dropped into willing ears. He reminded his followers and the families of warriors of old Comanche raids, of Kiowa men who had fallen to their lances in battles over hunting grounds. He pointed out the way Toya's eyes followed the outsider, the way she found excuses to be near him. He planted seeds of dishonor. "She forgets her duty," he would murmur to a group of warriors mending their gear. "The Comanche has bewitched her with some dark medicine." He shames her, and in doing so shames her father, and shames us all." The words were designed to prey on the pride of the warriors and the traditional values of the people. The tension in the camp grew thick and suffocating, like the air before a thunderstorm. The primary conflict was no longer about a single enemy warrior. It was about the heart of the tribe itself, about loyalty, tradition, and the unsettling influence of an outsider who was slowly, inexplicably, becoming one of them. The situation was a dry prairie, and Vokin was looking for a spark. He created one himself. One evening during the council fire, where the men of status gathered to smoke and discuss the tribe's affairs, Vokin rose to his feet. He held up a broken arrow for all to see. "This was found this morning near the southern grazing lands," he announced, his voice ringing with theatrical accusation. "The fletching is Comanche. It is a sign left for others to find. A message to his brothers telling them of our camp, of our weakness, and of the richness of our herds." He turned and pointed a finger directly at Kavan, who stood silently at the edge of the firelight, an observer to the council he was not permitted to join. "He is a spy. He uses the chief's daughter as a shield, winning her pity while he plots our destruction from within." A wave of outrage swept through the gathered warriors. Kavan stepped forward, his body tense, his face unreadable in the flickering light. "There was no message. I have sent no sign." "You lie," Vokin shouted, taking a step toward him. "Why else would a Comanche linger for so long in the camp of his enemies? Why else would you risk your life every day, unless a greater prize awaited you, the destruction of our people?" "I linger because you have not given me a horse to leave," Kavan replied, his voice dangerously calm, each word spoken with precision. "A warrior does not walk the plains like a beggar. Give me a horse, and I will ride out, and you will not see me again." The simple, undeniable truth of his statement, an appeal to the warrior's code, gave some of the men pause. A man's horse was his life. To be without one was the ultimate state of powerlessness. But Vokin was not to be deterred by logic or honor. He had planned this moment. He threw the broken arrow at Kavan's feet. "You will not be given a horse, you will earn your freedom or your death," Vokin declared. "I challenge you. A trial of combat. Tomorrow, at sunrise, me and you, with war clubs. No shields. If you are a true warrior with an honest heart, you will face me. If you are a coward and a spy, you will try to run in the night, and we will hunt you down like the snake you are." The challenge was absolute. A deathly hush fell over the council. All eyes turned to Chief Tashunka. The old chief looked weary, the lines on his face deeper than ever. He was caught in an impossible trap. He was caught between his most powerful and ambitious warrior, his future son-in-law, and the strange, silent man his daughter had saved, a man who had, against all odds, shown no malice. To deny the challenge would be to show weakness, to mortally insult Vokin and his powerful family, potentially splitting the tribe. To allow it was to sentence one of them to a brutal death. The honor of the tribe and his own authority were on the line. Tashunka looked at Vokin's burning eyes, then at Kavan's stoic calm. His gaze swept over the expectant faces of his warriors. He had no choice. "The challenge has been made according to the old ways," Tashunka said, his voice heavy as a tombstone. "It will be honored." The stakes had been raised to a deadly new height. Kavan's life now hung by the thread of a single, brutal combat. Toya, who had been watching from the shadows beyond the firelight, felt a cold dread wash over her, so intense it made her feel faint. This was not just about a broken arrow, this was about her. Vokin was forcing a choice, a resolution to be written in blood. The developing bond she shared with Kavan was no longer a secret, quiet thing. It was now the spark that would set their world on fire. The camp awoke before dawn, but it was not the cheerful, bustling awakening of a normal day. A heavy, somber silence hung in the air, thick with anticipation and dread. The duel was set for sunrise, and the entire tribe gathered in a wide circle on the flat ground west of the camp, the space reserved for ceremonies and grave pronouncements. Toya stood beside her mother, her face a pale, stoic mask that betrayed none of the frantic terror that was clawing at her insides. She had not slept. She had spent the night alternating between fervent, silent prayers to the spirits and a desperate, cycling panic. She watched as Kavan was led into the circle. He was stripped to his breechcloth, his hair unbound, his face impassive. He carried no personal medicine bag, no symbols of protection. He walked with a straight back and a steady stride, a man meeting his fate without fear. Vokin stood opposite him, already flexing the powerful war club in his hands, his face alight with a predator's eagerness. The sun began to crest the horizon, casting long, distorted shadows across the ground. Chief Tashunka stepped forward to proclaim the rules of combat, his voice heavy. But just as he opened his mouth to speak, a cry of alarm came from one of the lodges. It was a woman's voice, sharp with fear. Another cry followed, and then another. A young boy stumbled out of a teepee, his face flushed and collapsed, his body racked with a violent, dry cough. A new enemy had entered the camp, one far more insidious than a single Comanche warrior. It began with the children. A burning fever, a cough that rattled in their small chests, and then the spots, a cruel red blossom that spread across their skin, a sign dreaded by every tribe on the plains. The tribe's medicine woman, an ancient, wise crone named Soteo, whose face was a map of 100 seasons, examined the boy with a dread that chilled her to the bone. She had seen it before, years ago, after a visit from white traders. It was the white man's sickness, measles. A child's ailment to them, but a deadly plague to a people with no memory of it in their blood, no defense in their spirit. The duel was forgotten, the gathered tribes scattered, a wave of fear and panic breaking the ceremonial circle. Warriors who had been ready for bloodshed now rushed to their lodges, their faces etched with a new, more personal terror. The subplot of the disease had arrived, and it quickly overshadowed the impending duel. Vokin's personal vendetta suddenly seemed petty, his ambition trivial in the face of a threat that could wipe out their future. The laughter of children, the lifeblood of the camp, was replaced by the sounds of coughing and the weeping of mothers. The camp, once a vibrant hub of life, became a quiet, fearful hospital under the vast, indifferent sky. Soteo worked tirelessly, her ancient hands never still. She brewed teas from willow bark to fight the fever and made poultices of sacred herbs, chanting the old prayers to ward off the evil spirits that had invaded the camp. But her traditional remedies, so effective against the familiar ailments of the land, were little match for this new foreign enemy. The sickness, with a terrifying speed, spread to the adults, weakening warriors and elders alike. Toya worked alongside her mother and the other women, a tireless shadow moving from lodge to lodge, her own fear a cold knot in her stomach. The helplessness was a terrible weight, a tangible despair that was thicker than the smoke in the lodges. One afternoon, as she brought a cool cloth to a delirious Chaitan whose body was a furnace, Kavan appeared at the flap of their teepee. The guards who had been assigned to him had abandoned their posts, too consumed with worry for their own families. His face was grim. "I have seen this sickness before," he said, his voice low so only she could hear. "It struck the Penateka band of my people 2 winters ago. It took many. It took my own sister's child." Hope, fierce and desperate, flared in Toya's chest, so intense it was almost painful. "Did you find a way to fight it? Any way at all?" "Our healers are not so different from yours," he said, his eyes filled with a shared sorrow. "They tried everything, most failed, but they found one root. It does not kill the sickness, but it soothes the throat and clears the lungs so that the spirit has the strength to fight. It gives the children a chance." He described the plant. A tough, woody root with small, waxy leaves that grew only in certain places. It grows near the bitter water, where the earth is white with salt. Toya knew the place. It was a half-day's ride away, a salt flat on the edge of their territory that was usually avoided. "You must tell my father. You must tell Soteo." Kavan's expression was doubtful. "They will not listen to a Comanche. Vokin has already planted the seed that I am a sorcerer. They will say this is a trick to poison the whole tribe." He was right. The suspicion against him, though temporarily forgotten in the larger crisis, ran deep. But Toya would not let pride or prejudice stand in the way of her people's survival. She went to her father, who was sitting grimly before his lodge, the weight of his people's suffering heavy on his shoulders. With Kavan standing silently behind her, a respectful distance away, she explained what he had told her. Tashunka listened, his face impassive. Soteo, who was nearby, her eyes clouded with fatigue and sorrow, was openly skeptical. "We have our own medicine, the medicine of our grandmothers. Why should we trust the word of an enemy? His magic could be dark." Because our medicine is not working. Toya's voice was sharp with a desperation that bordered on insubordination. Look at Chaitin, look at the others, they are dying. What harm is there in trying? Do we let them die for our pride? The plea of a chief's daughter for her own brother, for all the children, could not be ignored. Tashunka, seeing the fierce logic in her words and the terror in her eyes, finally gave his consent. His gaze fell on Kavan. If this is a lie, he said, his voice flat and hard, your death will not be as swift as the one Vokin promised you. He turned to two of his warriors, whose own families were untouched by the sickness. Go, take the Comanche, he will show you this plant, watch him. If he tries to flee, or if this is a trick, you know what to do. The subplot had now become deeply intertwined with the main conflict. Kavan's fate no longer rested on a duel with Vokin, but on the efficacy of a route he claimed would save them. He rode out with the warriors, his life and his honor hanging in the balance. Vokin, who had been strangely quiet during the crisis, watched them go, his face a thundercloud of resentment. He had been denied his swift, violent resolution, and was now forced to watch his rival potentially become a hero. He returned to his work, sowing new seeds of doubt among the grieving families. It is convenient, is it not? He said to those who would listen, his voice dripping with false sympathy. The Comanche brings a sickness with one hand and offers a cure with the other. He seeks to make us dependent on him, to indebt our very lives to his foreign magic. Kavan returned with a pouch full of the gnarled roots. So Toya, under Tashunka's direct command, examined them with suspicion before reluctantly brewing them into a bitter, dark tea. Toya was the first to administer it, forcing the pungent liquid past the lips of her feverish brother. For 2 days, the camp held its breath. The sickness had reached its peak. The air was heavy with the smell of medicine and the ever-present shadow of death. The tension was unbearable, a bowstring pulled to its breaking point. This secondary challenge had diverted everyone's focus, but in doing so, it had raised the stakes for Kavan and Toya to an impossible height. His success would earn him the gratitude of the people, but the eternal, murderous hatred of Vokin. His failure would mean not just his own death, but the end of any hope for their future, and the doom of half the tribe. The first sign of hope came on the 3rd morning. Chaitin's fever broke. His breathing, though still shallow, had lost its ragged, rattling edge. He asked for water, his voice a weak croak, but it was the first sensible word he had spoken in days. Within a day, several other of the younger patients began to show similar improvement. A cautious, fragile relief began to spread through the camp, as tentative as the first green shoots after a prairie fire. The Comanche's medicine, it seemed, was working. The tea was distributed to all who were sick, and while the plague did not vanish overnight, its deadly grip began to loosen. Toya felt a joy so profound it was almost painful. She saw Kavan across the camp, helping an old man carry a bucket of water, and their eyes met. In that single, shared glance, a world of gratitude, relief, and deepening affection was exchanged. The bond that had been forged in secret was now cemented by a shared, public trial. Kavan was no longer just the Comanche prisoner. He was the man who had brought them a cure. The respect in the eyes of many of the Kiowa was now genuine and deep. They began to call him not the Comanche, but Kavan. But just as the dawn of hope began to break, the darkest shadow fell. The sickness, while receding from the young and strong, claimed one last victim. An old woman, the grandmother of Vokin's closest ally, a woman beloved by the entire tribe for her stories and her kindness, succumbed to the illness in her sleep. She was old, her spirit weak, and she had been too far gone for any medicine to save her. The tragedy, though one of many, was the opening Vokin had been waiting for. He turned the camp's grief into a weapon with terrifying skill. He stood before the mourning family's teepee, his voice ringing with righteous fury, a masterful performance of sorrow and rage. "We celebrate a false cure while our revered elder is dead," he cried, his voice breaking with feigned sorrow. "The Comanche's medicine is a trick. It is a poison, a slow poison that takes the weak and spares the strong to make us believe he is a savior. He chose who would live and who would die. He has murdered her as surely as if he had used a knife." The accusation was monstrous, a lie spun from jealousy, but it landed on the fertile ground of fear and grief. The woman's death was a terrible blow, and the people, in their pain, needed someone to blame. The fragile trust in Kavan shattered like a clay pot dropped on stone. The murmurs of respect turned to angry shouts. Vokin, seizing the moment, led a group of his warriors to where Kavan stood, watching the scene with a look of weary disbelief. "Murderer," Vokin snarled, shoving Kavan to the ground. "You will pay for this." Toya ran to them, trying to place herself between them. "Stop, it was the sickness, you know this. His medicine saved Chaitin, it saved the others." Vokin pushed her aside with a roughness that shocked the onlookers. "Stay out of this, woman. Your heart is clouded by this snake. You cannot see the truth." Chief Tushunka arrived, his face a grim, stony mask. He saw the fury in Vokin's eyes, the volatile anger of the crowd, the body of the beloved elder being prepared for her final journey. The pressure was immense. To defend the Comanche now would be to side against his own people, against his most powerful warrior, in a moment of profound collective grief. His daughter's pleas were drowned out by the cries for vengeance. Tushunka's heart was heavy with a terrible choice, but as a chief, there was only one path he could take to restore order and prevent a bloodbath in his own camp. He looked at Kavan, not with hatred, but with a deep, sorrowful regret, the look of a man trapped by his duty. "The people have spoken," he said, his voice devoid of all emotion. "Their grief demands a price. Seize him. At sunrise he will be cast out. He will be given no horse, no water, no weapon. He will walk back to his own lands. The spirits of the plains will decide his fate." It was a death sentence. To be cast out onto the plains without resources was to be given to the sun, the thirst, and the wolves. It was a slower, crueler fate than a quick death in combat, a way of satisfying the crowd without the chief having to bloody his own hands. They dragged Kavan away, ignoring his quiet protests of innocence. Toya screamed, fighting to get to him, but her father's warriors held her back. "Father, no. You know he is innocent. You know this is Vokin's lie." Tushunka would not meet her eyes. "It is done," he said, his voice like stone. He ordered his men to take Toya to his teepee and to guard it. She will not interfere. Locked in the familiar space of her home, which now felt like a prison, Toya collapsed onto the buffalo robes. The hope that had bloomed so brightly just hours before was crushed into dust. Every path was blocked. Her people, manipulated by Vokin's hatred, had turned on the man who had saved them. Her own father had condemned him. Kavan was going to die. And their love, a thing so new and fragile, would die with him, a secret she would carry in silence for the rest of her miserable life. The despair was absolute, a darkness so complete it seemed the sun would never rise again. This was the true defeat, the moment where all seemed irrevocably lost. The night was a suffocating blanket of grief. Toya sat in the darkness of her father's lodge, the sounds of her people's mourning for the old woman, a distant, painful echo of her own private funeral. The silhouettes of the guards at the entrance were a constant reminder of her powerlessness. Despair had settled in her bones, cold and heavy. She saw her future stretching before her. A long gray path of duty beside a man she despised. A life haunted by the ghost of a Comanche warrior who had shown her what it was to be truly seen. But as the hours wore on, something else began to stir beneath the grief. A spark of defiance, an anger so pure and hot it burned away the tears. The image of Kavan's face as they dragged him away, not of fear, but of a deep, profound betrayal, was seared into her mind. They were going to let him die for a crime of another man's invention. Her father, her people, they were all choosing the easy lie over the difficult truth. She would not. Her resignation, the habit of a lifetime, broke. The passive princess died in that dark teepee, and a warrior was born in her place. She began to move, her actions quiet and deliberate. She gathered a small pouch of dried meat and berries from her mother's stores, a full water skin, a sharp flint knife. From her father's things, she took a fire starter. These were small things, but on the plains, they were the difference between life and death. Her catalyst for renewal was not a grand realization from the spirits, but a simple, undeniable truth that settled in her heart. A life without Kavan was not a life she was willing to live. She would rather die with him on the plains than live without him in the suffocating safety of her camp. Her first challenge was the guards. She waited until the deepest point of the night, when the moon was down and the camp was sunk in an exhausted sleep. Peering through the lodge flap, she saw the two warriors leaning on their spears, their heads nodding. She recalled a trickster's tale her grandmother had told her. Taking a pinch of the strong, sacred tobacco from her father's ceremonial pipe, she crept to the edge of the tepee, and with a small puff of breath, blew it towards the guards. The potent, sleep-inducing scent, an old hunting trick for calming nervous animals, worked its magic on the tired men. Within minutes, their heads drooped lower, their breathing deepening into snores. She slipped out like a shadow. The camp was a maze of sleeping giants. She moved from one dark patch to another, her moccasins making no sound on the packed earth. She reached the prisoner's lodge, her heart hammering. A single warrior sat outside, but he too was asleep. She slit the lacing of the tepee flap with her knife and crawled inside. Kavan was sitting up, his back against a post, his face etched in the faint starlight filtering through the smoke hole. He was not asleep. He was waiting for the dawn, waiting for death, with a warrior's composure. He looked up as she entered, and his eyes widened in disbelief. "Toya, what are you doing? Go back, they will punish you." "We will be punished," she corrected him, pressing the water skin and food pouch into his hands, "if we are caught." She moved to his side and began sawing at the thick rawhide bonds at his wrists with her knife. "We are leaving." The finality in her voice stunned him into silence. He watched her, this chief's daughter, this woman who was promised to another, risking everything for him. The rawhide snapped. He was free. He rubbed his wrists, his eyes never leaving her face. The look in them was a fire that warmed her to her soul. "The horses," he whispered. "We need horses." "I know," she said. "My pinto. And your stallion." Vokin kept him near his own lodge, a prize of war. They crept to the edge of the herd. The horses stirred, their scents filling the air. As Kavan reached for the lead of his powerful black stallion, a voice cut through the darkness, sharp and cold as ice. "I knew you would not be able to stay away from him." Vokin stepped out from behind a tepee, a heavy war club in his hand. Behind him were two of his most loyal followers. They were caught. Kavan instantly pushed Toya behind him, shielding her with his body. "This is between us, Vokin. Let her go." "She made her choice," Vokin sneered. "She chose an enemy over her own people. She is a traitor, and you are a dead man." He lunged. The fight was brutal and swift. Kavan, though unarmed, was a whirlwind of motion, dodging the vicious swings of the club, using his opponent's momentum against him. But it was 3 against 1. As he fought Vokin, the other two closed in, their knives glinting. The commotion had roused the camp. Torches flared to life. People poured from their lodges, their sleep-filled faces turning to shock as they saw the scene. The Comanche prisoner fighting their greatest warrior, and the chief's daughter standing beside the enemy. Chief Tashunka arrived, his face a mask of thunder. "Stop this," he roared. But Vokin, consumed by his rage and so close to his victory, did not listen. He saw his chance as Kavan was occupied with the other two warriors. He raised his club high for a final, deadly, skull-crushing blow. "No," Toya screamed. She did not think. She acted. She launched herself at Vokin, a small, fierce whirlwind of desperation, shoving him with all her might. He was bigger, stronger, but the move was so unexpected it broke his balance. He stumbled, his blow going wide, and striking the earth with a dull thud. The unexpected intervention startled everyone into a moment of stillness. Toya stood between Kavan and Vokin, her chest heaving, her eyes blazing with a fire no one had ever seen in them before. "This has gone on long enough," she said, her voice ringing with a newfound power that carried across the silent crowd. She turned to her father, to her people. "You have been blinded, not by this man," she said, gesturing to Kavan, who now stood beside her, "but by this one." She pointed a trembling finger at Vokin. "He does not care for the death of an elder. He cares only for his pride. He used your grief to condemn an innocent man, because he could not stand to see that I did not love him." The accusation, so direct and raw, hung in the air, shocking in its honesty. "This man," she continued, her voice growing stronger, her hand finding Kavan's, their fingers intertwining in a grip of iron, "brought us the medicine that saved your children. He is a man of honor. Vokin is the one who poisons this tribe, with his jealousy and his ambition. I will not marry him. I will not be a pawn in his games. I choose a life with a man who sees me, not my title." I choose Kavan." Her declaration was a stone dropped into a silent lake, its ripples shaking the very foundation of their society. She had defied her betrothal, her father, her entire tribe, in a public act of rebellion and love. Tushunka stared at his daughter, as if seeing her for the first time. He saw the strength in her, the fire he had not known existed. He saw the undeniable truth in her eyes, and he saw the venomous, murderous hatred in Vokin's. Kavan stood tall beside her, their joined hands a vow. They were a united front against the world. "They are outcasts," Vokin hissed, his face contorted in an ugly mask of fury. "They have betrayed us all. They must die." Tushunka looked at his daughter and the Comanche warrior, their hands clasped together in the torchlight. He saw their defiance, their love, and the terrible price they were willing to pay. His heart was torn, a battleground of love for his child and duty to his people. He could not execute his own daughter, but he could not allow this open rebellion to stand. He could not force a war within his own camp. "Go," he said, his voice thick with a sorrow that was deeper than anger. "Go now, before blood is spilled that cannot be washed away. You have chosen this path. From this moment, you are no longer Kiowa. From this moment, you are no longer my daughter. Go." It was both a reprieve and an exile, a condemnation and a gift of life. Kavan, wasting no time, grabbed the reins of his stallion and Toya's pinto. He swung onto his horse and pulled her up behind him. For a fleeting moment, her eyes met her mother's in the crowd. Istas had tears streaming down her face, but in her eyes was a flicker of understanding, and perhaps of pride. Then they were gone, galloping out into the vast, dark plains, leaving behind the only life they had ever known. They had faced the climax of their conflict, not with a great battle, but with a choice. And that choice had cost them everything, except each other. The plains became their new home, a world of endless grass and sky that was both a terrifying wilderness and a cathedral of freedom. They were fugitives, adrift in the great ocean of land between the world of the Kiowa who had cast them out and the world of the Comanche who would not know them. In the first weeks, the loss was a palpable ache. Toya would watch the sunrise and feel a pang of longing for the familiar sounds of her camp, for the faces of her family, for the easy companionship of the women she had known her whole life. Kavan bore his own silent grief, a man without a people for the second time in his life. They had love, a fierce and tender thing that had been tested in fire, but they were utterly alone, their survival, a question that the rising sun asked them each morning. Their bond, forged in conflict, was now tempered in the daily, grinding struggle for existence. Kavan's skills, once a source of suspicion, now became their lifeline. He taught Toya the deep craft of the plains. How to find water where none seemed to exist by following the flight of certain birds, how to hunt with a quiet deadliness that left no trace, how to read the clouds for signs of a coming storm. Toya, in turn, brought a sense of home to their harsh, nomadic life. She found a sheltered canyon carved by an ancient river, with a hidden spring of fresh water and a stand of cottonwoods that would shield them from the winter winds. It became their refuge. She used her skills to make their small camp a place of comfort, tanning the hides he brought back, her hands always busy, creating order out of the wildness. She built a life while he sustained it. In the quiet of the evenings, sitting by their fire, the last barriers between them dissolved. They spoke of their dreams, the ones they had lost, and the new ones they were timidly beginning to build together. He told her of his desire to have a family, a desire he thought had died with his first wife in the snow. She spoke of her profound relief at being free from the weight of her title, the unexpected joy of a life where her worth was not tied to an alliance or a man's ambition. In their shared vulnerability, they found an intimacy deeper than any they had ever known. They had attained a peace, but it was a fragile, hard-won peace, earned one sunrise at a time. As the leaves of the cottonwoods in their canyon turned to gold and the air grew crisp with the coming of autumn, a rider appeared on the ridge above them. He was Kiowa. Kavan instinctively reached for his bow, and Toya stood before him, a shield. But the rider carried a staff of truce and raised an open palm. It was Chaitan, her brother, now a young man with a seriousness in his eyes that had not been there before. He dismounted and stood before them, his gaze filled with a mixture of awe and relief. "I have been searching for many weeks," he said. He brought them news from the camp they had fled. After their departure, Vokin's influence had begun to wane. His obsessive hatred had been laid bare for all to see, and with his rival gone, his venom had no target and began to poison himself. Many began to question the truth of his accusations. The real turning point came when a Kiowa hunting party encountered a band of Arapaho who had also been ravaged by the measles. They, too, spoke of a bitter root that had eased the suffering, a root given to them in trade by the Comanche. The story confirmed Kavan's innocence beyond all doubt. Vokin, disgraced and abandoned by his followers, his lies exposed by a truth carried on the wind, had left the camp in the dead of night, his ambition having turned to ash in his mouth. The subplot of his treachery had found its final resolution in shame. "Father, he is not the same," Chaitin continued, his voice soft. "He is a chief who was forced to choose between his people's unity and his daughter's heart. He carries a great sadness. He sent me to find you. He wants you to know that you are not hunted. The path is open. You can come home." The news was a seismic shock. The life they had built in their canyon, their quiet new stasis, was suddenly presented with a new, dizzying choice. The pull of family, of people, of belonging, was a powerful current. Toya looked at the distant plains, her heart aching with a longing for her mother, for the familiar rhythms of the life she had lost. She and Kavan spoke long into the night, the fire burning low. To return would be to step back into a world of rules and expectations. Could their love, so wild and free, born of defiance, survive within the confines of a tribal camp, even a welcoming one? But to stay away forever was to be rootless, to deny their future children a heritage and a people. In the morning they gave Chaitin their answer. They would not return to the camp to live, but they would not remain in hiding. They would make their home here, in this canyon that was neither Kiowa nor Comanche land, but simply their own. They would be a bridge. They would visit, they would trade, their children would know their grandparents and their kin, but they would live a life of their own making, a life forged on their own terms. As Chaitin rode away, carrying their message of peace and a promise to visit before the first snow, Toya and Kavan stood together, watching him go. The final threads of the old conflicts were being resolved, not in a great public ceremony, but in the quiet acceptance of a new reality. Their new life was established, not as a return to the past, but as a step into a different future. Toya leaned her head against Kavan's shoulder, her hand resting on her still flat stomach, where a new life, a new secret, had just begun to take root. She looked at the vast open sky, a sky that had once seemed to her a symbol of her confinement. Now it was a symbol of endless possibility. The central themes of her life, resilience, the power of connection, the redefinition of her own worth, were not just ideas, but truths she was now living. She had faced down judgment and prejudice, and had found acceptance not from her tribe, but from within herself and from the love of one man. Theirs was not a story that would be told in the grand histories of the chiefs and the great battles. It was a quieter story, a story of two people from warring worlds who had found a common language in respect, a shared strength in vulnerability, and a love that was strong enough to build a new home in the heart of the unforgiving wilderness. They had faced the storms and found their peace, an earned peace, quiet and profound, a testament to the enduring power of a love that dared to choose its own path.